The text that came through Pearson on a Tuesday morning was exactly 11 words long, and Hazel Brennan read it 3 times before her brain caught up with what her eyes were seeing. I think we should end this. You deserve someone less complicated. Less complicated, as if she were the complicated one. As if she hadn't spent the last 2 years rearranging her entire life around Derek's schedule. His moods, his mother's opinions about her apartment being a little too cozy for a serious relationship. Less complicated. She stood in the middle of gate C14, her rolling bag bumping the heel of the man in front of her, her boarding pass crumpling in her left fist, and she thought, 11 words. 2 years. 11 words. The gate agent called Group B. Hazel didn't move. She'd saved for 8 months for this trip to Vancouver, a writer's retreat that her friend Priya had badgered her into attending, the kind of thing Hazel always found a reason to skip. She taught English at Lakeview Secondary in Ottawa. She read other people's stories for a living and hadn't finished one of her own in 4 years. The retreat was supposed to fix that. Derek had said it was a nice idea, the way people say nice idea about things they expect you to eventually talk yourself out of. She hadn't talked herself out of it. She'd booked the flight, arranged a substitute, packed the green canvas bag she'd owned since university with the broken zipper she kept meaning to replace. And then, this morning, at 6:47 a.m., standing in the security line with her shoes off and her dignity-optional 11 words. Group C was being called now. The man to her left. She hadn't really looked at him, she'd been staring at her phone, shifted slightly, and in shifting, knocked her boarding pass out of her hand. They both reached for it at the same time, their heads nearly collided. She grabbed it first, straightened up and said, "I'm fine," before he'd even asked, because she was absolutely not fine, and she needed to say it out loud to someone, even a stranger, even incorrectly. He looked at her. Not the quick look people give strangers in airports, a longer one. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm cold, it's 24 degrees in here." "I run cold." He didn't push it. He had the look of someone who had long since decided that pushing things was rarely worth the effort. Jaw set, dark eyes that were more tired than unfriendly, the kind of expensive but understated jacket that Hazel associated with men who had assistants. He picked up his own bag, a slim leather carry-on, and looked back toward the gate. "They're calling Group D," he said. Hazel looked at her boarding pass. Group D. She got on the plane. His name, she learned much later, was Connor Whitfield. At the time, he was just the man in 14B, which was the middle seat beside her window seat, which meant that for 4 hours and 20 minutes, she was either going to have to talk to him or perform the very specific kind of studied indifference that economy class demanded. He had the armrest. She didn't fight him for it. She pulled out the novel she'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks, a romance, because she was a cliché and she'd made her peace with it, and she read the same paragraph 9 times. He was on his laptop. Whatever was on the screen made him frown steadily for the first hour. He took one call, stepping over her to stand in the aisle, speaking low and quick into his phone in the clipped, efficient way of someone accustomed to being listened to the first time. When he sat back down, he looked at the novel in her hands. "Any good?" he asked. "Theoretically." A pause. "Theoretically. I've been reading the same page for an hour." He looked at her again with that same unhurried directness. "The text?" She turned her phone face down on the tray table. "What text?" "The one you read 4 times before we boarded." She'd thought he wasn't paying attention. That was the thing about men like him, she thought. They paid attention. They just didn't let on. "My boyfriend broke up with me," she said. "Ex-boyfriend. As of 6:50 this morning. I'm sorry. Don't be." It was 11 words. If someone is going to end a 2-year relationship, they should at minimum use a full paragraph. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The beginning of deciding whether to. 2 years deserves at least 3 sentences, he agreed. A closing statement. Possibly a cited source. This time he did smile briefly, and it changed the whole architecture of his face. Hazel looked back at her book. She slept somewhere over Lake Superior, which she hadn't intended to do. When she woke up, he was still on his laptop, and there was a coffee on her tray table, still warm, with one of those little paper cups of cream she hadn't asked for. She looked at it for a moment. "They came through while you were asleep," he said, without looking up. "You looked like you needed it." She drank it without saying thank you, because it felt like the thank you was already implied in the drinking, and because she was still half asleep and her filters were not fully operational. "I'm Hazel," she said. "Connor," he said. That was all. But something settled. Vancouver in September had that particular quality of light that made everything look like a film still. Gold and gray in alternating layers, the mountains doing their constant dramatic thing above the water. Hazel came out of the terminal into it and stood there for a moment, just breathing. She'd forgotten, somewhere in the middle of the last 2 years, to look forward to things. Connor came out behind her. They'd somehow walked off the plane together without quite deciding to, the way you fall into step with someone who's going the same direction. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Kitsilano. Writer's Retreat." She made a face she couldn't help making. "I teach high school English and haven't written anything in 4 years, so I'm presumably about to be very humbled. What stopped you writing?" No one had ever asked her that directly. Most people said you should get back to it or I'm sure you'll find the time, which was not the same thing as asking. She thought about it seriously for the first time in a while. "I started only finishing other people's sentences," she said. "Red pen, marginal notes, this paragraph is strong, but this one doesn't earn its place. I got so good at seeing the problems in everyone else's work that I stopped being able to not see them in mine." She paused. "That probably sounds absurd. It sounds like you understand something that most people take years to figure out." She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked for her cab. His car was already there. Not a cab, a black sedan with a driver who called him Mr. Whitfield and took his bag with the wordless efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times before. Hazel noticed. She filed it away without comment. "The retreat," he said. "How long?" "A week." He nodded. He seemed to think about saying something else and then said, "Finish the book," and got in the car. She stood on the curb and watched it pull away, and thought that was a very strange thing to have as a last impression of someone, and that it was probably the last impression she'd have of him. The retreat was held at a rented house in Kitsilano, 3 blocks from the beach, run by a woman named Patricia, not the retreat facilitator type Hazel had feared, but a sharp-eyed novelist in her 60s who made strong coffee and stronger observations. There were 8 participants. Hazel was the only one who taught secondary school. The others were a poet from Calgary, a retired journalist writing his memoirs, a woman who'd sold her tech company, and was now, somewhat defiantly, writing a fantasy novel. On the second evening, they had a reading. Hazel read a page and a half of something she'd started on the plane, coming down over the mountains, about a woman standing on an airport curb watching someone drive away. The room was quiet after. "There's someone else in this," Patricia said. "We can feel him without seeing him. That's hard to do. Keep going." Hazel went back to her room and kept going. She ran into Connor Whitfield on Thursday. She was at a cafe on West 4th, the kind that smelled like cardamom and had mismatched chairs and played Joni Mitchell at a volume that suggested respect rather than wallpaper. She was at a corner table with her notebook open, and she'd been there long enough that the barista had stopped offering refills and just left a carafe. She was in the middle of a sentence she'd been trying to write for 4 years. The real sentence. The one underneath all the other sentences, and she was so deep inside it that she didn't see him until he was standing at the counter and had already seen her. He came over. He was in a different jacket, still understated, still that quality of simplicity that only cost a lot of money. He looked like he'd slept poorly. "The English teacher," he said. "The man from 14B, she said. He looked at the carafe, the open notebook, the pen she'd been gripping so hard there was a mark on her finger. "You're writing, I appear to be, yes?" he asked. And she could tell he was asking carefully whether he could sit for a minute. She said yes, because what she was writing had reached the part where she needed to stop and think, and because she was curious about him in a way she hadn't been curious about anyone in a long time. "What do you do?" she asked, because she still didn't know, only knew the leather bag and the sedan and the driver who called him Mr. Whitfield, he told her. Not in the way of men who expected to impress. He said it the way you say something you've been doing so long, it's become just a fact about yourself. A property development company he'd started 12 years ago, offices in Vancouver and Toronto, currently in the middle of a project that was causing him a considerable amount of difficulty. He'd flown to Vancouver to deal with it in person. "How considerable?" she asked. $70 million of considerable. She absorbed that. "And you're sitting in a cafe." "I'm sitting in a cafe," he agreed, "because I have been staring at the same contract clause for 3 days and I am starting to confuse the words." Hazel laughed. It surprised her. It surprised him too by the look of it. Not a polite laugh. A real one, at the image of this composed, expensive man baffled by a piece of paper. "I know that feeling," she said when she could. "Professionally, that is. Red pen and everything." He was looking at her in that way again, the unrushed way. "What's the sentence?" he asked. "Sorry?" "The one you've been trying to write. You had the look of someone very close to something." She turned the notebook a few degrees but didn't hand it to him. He read what was there without leaning in. It was one sentence, and it said, she had been so careful for so long that she had forgotten that careful wasn't the same as safe. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the one," he said. "I know," she said. They stayed for another hour. She learned that he had a younger sister in Montreal, that he ran every morning as a kind of compulsory maintenance, that he had been engaged once, 4 years ago, and that the engagement had ended and left him, in his own words, efficient. She told him about Derek and the 11 words, and how she had spent 2 years being smaller than she actually was, because smaller seemed like something she could sustain. He listened the way she imagined good readers listened, not waiting for his turn, actually receiving. When she finally closed the notebook and said she had to get back, he stood when she did, which was an old-fashioned thing that she noted with some involuntary warmth. "Dinner," he said. "Tomorrow, if you have a break in the retreat. There's a place on Granville Island, I know." It was not quite a question. She liked that it was not quite a question. "Fine," she said. "But I'm not good at expensive restaurants. Why not? I say the wrong fork and I feel guilty about it for weeks." "There's only one fork," he said. There was not, as she discovered the next evening, only one fork. There were 3. But Connor identified each one with the gravity of a man who found it genuinely important that she not feel guilty about silverware, and she thought, watching him do this, that he was more careful with people than he appeared. That the efficiency was a container, not the thing itself. The restaurant looked out over False Creek. The water was dark and silver, and the lights of the city sat on it, loosely, the way light does when it isn't sure of its welcome. She ordered the halibut. He ordered the same. They talked for 3 hours, and she didn't notice the time until the restaurant was nearly empty, and the waiter had refilled their water glasses 4 times, with the patient optimism of someone expecting a larger tip. She told him about the things she'd been writing. Not all of it, the shape of it. A woman who'd spent so long teaching others to tell the truth in their work that she'd lost the habit of it in her own life. He was quiet after, the way he'd been quiet after then since in the notebook. "What happened to her?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "I think you do," he said. She didn't answer. Outside, the water did its silver thing. On the walk back along the seawall, it was cool enough that she'd pulled her jacket closed, and at some point, without really noting when it happened, his hand was at the small of her back, not directing, just present, and she didn't move away from it. She had 2 days left in Vancouver when his deal collapsed. She found out because she texted him to confirm Saturday, and he replied 2 hours later. Might be a difficult day, dealing with something. She called instead. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," she said. He did. The project, the $70 million considerable problem, had come apart at a zoning level. A bureaucratic decision that reversed months of approvals and potentially took down 2 years of work with it. He was calm when he described it, the specific calm of someone who is furious and has decided that fury will not help. She recognized it. She used it herself in classrooms, in parent meetings, in the 2 years of being smaller than she was. "Come for a walk," she said. "Hazel, you've been staring at it for 2 days. Come for a walk." He came. They walked the seawall for 2 hours, past the marina and the park and the concession stand that was closed for the season. He talked and she listened, and she asked the questions she'd have asked a student. Not what's wrong, but what do you actually want to happen here? Not what are you afraid of, but what would you do if you weren't? He stopped walking at some point. They were near the water, the mountains behind them going dark with evening. "No one asks me things like that," he said. It wasn't a complaint, it was just a fact he was discovering. "You've arranged your life so they don't have to," she said. And then, because it was gentle but it was also true, she let it stand. He looked at her for a long moment. The water was doing its thing. The mountains were dark and certain. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "since the plane, about the 2 years. About the 11 words, Connor. I'm not comparing. I know it's not the same." He turned toward the water. "I've been engaged." I was going to marry someone who was perfectly suited to my life and had nothing to do with who I actually was. And when it ended, I told myself it was because the timing was wrong. The timing was not wrong. The timing was the excuse. She waited. I've been efficient, he said, for 4 years. And I think I'm done being efficient. The mountains were dark. The water was silver. Hazel thought about the sentence in her notebook, about the difference between careful and safe, and thought that she had known, somewhere in the middle of writing it, who she was writing it about. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at it, then at her. I'm going back to Ottawa on Sunday, she said. I know, my life is papers to mark and a broken zipper and 2 years of being smaller than I am. It's not. I've seen you write, he said. I've watched you ask the right questions. I've had dinner with you for 3 hours and didn't notice the time. He squeezed her hand once, with intention. You're not small, Hazel. She looked at the water for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, to whatever you're asking. Okay. He laughed. A real laugh, unpracticed and warm, and it was the best thing she'd heard in longer than she could account for. Sunday came the way Sundays do when you'd rather they didn't. She packed the green canvas bag with the broken zipper, said goodbye to Patricia, who pressed a handwritten note into her palm that Hazel read on the cab ride and cried a little about. It said, finish it. You're almost there. She sat in the departures lounge at departures level 2 and thought about gates and beginnings and the particular comedy of things that start as minor disasters. Her phone buzzed. A message from Connor, Gate B7. She looked up. Across the departures lounge, at Gate B7, he was standing with his leather bag and a different jacket looking at her. She typed back, You have a flight? He typed back, Toronto. But I have a meeting in Ottawa next week. She typed, You don't have a meeting in Ottawa. 3 dots. Then I do now. She put the phone in her pocket and walked across the departures lounge, and he watched her the whole way in that unrushed, particular way of his. And when she reached him, she said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say that improved on the moment, and he smiled. The full version, the one that changed everything, and said, very quietly, I think you should know that I've read the same clause of this contract approximately 40 times since Tuesday, and I can't tell you what it says. That's terrible contract management, she said. It's your fault, specifically. She laughed, and then she didn't laugh, because he was looking at her in a way that precluded laughing, and she thought, 2 years of being smaller. 11 words on a Tuesday morning, a middle seat over Lake Superior and a coffee she hadn't asked for. She had been so careful for so long, she had forgotten that careful wasn't the same as safe. Ottawa, she said. Ottawa, he confirmed. She took his hand for the second time, and this time she didn't let go. 8 months later, Connor Whitfield stood in the hallway of Lakeview Secondary School in Ottawa on a Friday afternoon, holding a bunch of yellow tulips that the woman at the flower stand had called cheerful, and that he thought looked exactly like Hazel looked when she was correcting something, bright and precise and not to be argued with. He'd had to get a visitor's badge. The woman at the front desk had recognized his name from the news, and tried not to look like she recognized his name from the news. He'd signed the clipboard and said thank you and found the right hallway. Through the narrow window in the classroom door, he could see her. She was at the front of the room, mid-sentence, gesturing at something on the board. One of the students said something and she laughed. That real laugh, the unfiltered one. And half the class smiled without seeming to realize they were doing it. He stood in the hallway and watched her for a minute. The way she moved through a room she knew completely. The way she made people feel attended to without even appearing to try. And he thought about the seawall and the water, and I've been efficient for 4 years and I'm done. The bell rang. Students came out. Several of them looked at him with undisguised curiosity. One of them said, Are you here for Ms. Brennan? And he said yes, and the student nodded gravely and said, Good choice. Hazel came out last, her bag over one shoulder, a red pen still in her hand. She stopped when she saw him. Then she looked at the tulips. You're not supposed to be here until 6, she said. I finished early. You've never finished early in your life. I'm working on it. She looked at him for a moment, the same way she'd looked at him on the seawall, like she was reading for what was underneath. He let her look. He'd learned, over these 8 months, that she needed to look, that it was how she made sure a thing was real. I finished it, she said. He understood immediately. The book. Last night. 3 in the morning. I typed the last sentence and then I sat there for about 20 minutes not knowing what to do with my hands. What's the last sentence? She smiled. She let go of careful and chose real. He handed her the tulips. She took them in the hand with the red pen, which meant she was holding flowers, and a red pen, which meant she looked exactly like herself. Dinner, he said. Somewhere with one fork. You promised one fork. I keep my promises. She tucked the red pen behind her ear and started walking, and he fell into step beside her, the way you fall into step with someone when you've stopped deciding and started knowing. And they went out through the front doors of Lakeview Secondary, into the Friday afternoon light of an Ottawa October. That particular quality of golden cold that reminded her, a little, of Vancouver, of mountains, of a departures lounge, and a text with 11 words that had cracked something open. She'd written a book in 8 months. She'd started it on a plane over Lake Superior with her filters down and her heart in pieces, she thought, walking beside him in the October light with a bunch of yellow tulips and a red pen behind her ear. That broken was sometimes just the beginning of a better shape.